Sometimes when we face conflict, when we face walls that are so big, our instinct is to forget about it, move on to something else. But God does not always give you a strategy that looks powerful before it becomes effective. What's interesting is in Joshua chapter 6, when we see Jericho's walls, we see the strange marching pattern, the trumpet blasts, and the destruction of what was devoted to God, we'll understand why it is so important and how we can use these stories to help us face our own walls in our own life. And I'll give you one immediate action to help you obey God when His way feels unusual. In this episode of Biblical Unlocks, this show is designed to help build your habit of reading the Bible, understanding the Bible, and applying it in your daily life. If you enjoy episodes like this, please consider following and rating the show. It's free, it helps me out a lot, and you can always change your mind later. Now let's get a little bit of context into the chapter. Okay, so Joshua chapter 6, this is the fall of Jericho. God is telling Israel to march around the city 7 days, with the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant and blowing the trumpets. On the seventh day, the walls fall, the city is devoted to destruction. Rahab and her household were spared, we remember that from Joshua chapter 2, and Achan's later disobedience is foreshadowed by the command not to take what belongs to the Lord. And the chapter is actually going to show us that victory comes by obedience, not by human force. Okay, so let's read verses 1 to 5. The focus here is going to be Jericho being shut up and God giving marching instructions. My question for you is, why would God make Israel march instead of attack? Verse 1. Now Jericho was shut up inside and out because of the Israelites. No one came out and no one went in. The Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have handed Jericho over to you, along with its king and soldiers. You shall march around the city, all the warriors circling the city once. Thus you shall do for 6 days, with 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. On the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, the priests blowing the trumpets." Alright, biblical unlock number 1. Why does God tell Israel to march instead of attack? The reason is because the battle belongs to the Lord. The marching here is not a pointless endeavor, it is obedient waiting. It is training the people, again, to trust God's timing and God's power. Jericho is sealed shut so no one can claim that Israel won by clever tactics. God removes, right? God's way is removing human bragging, and it's actually making the victory unmistakably His. And this is something God does over and over and over again. The bread from heaven, right? It's to show dependence on God. And unusual commands are actually a test of trust. They show that God sometimes humbles pride by making obedience look strange before it actually looks wise. Okay, let's read verses 6 to 11 now. This is going to be focused on the first 6 days of marching, and what is God teaching through repetition and restraint in this particular section. Verse 6. So Joshua son of Nun summoned the priests and said to them, "Take up the ark of the covenant and have 7 priests carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark of the Lord." To the people he said, "Go forward and march around the city. Have the armed men pass on before the ark of the Lord." As Joshua had commanded the people, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord went forward, blowing the trumpets with the ark of the covenant of the Lord following them. And the armed men went before the priests who blew the trumpets. The rear guard came after the ark, while the trumpet blew continually. To the people Joshua gave this command, "You shall not shout or let your voice be heard, nor shall you utter a word until the day I tell you to shout. Then you shall shout." So the ark of the Lord went around the city, circling it once, and they came into the camp and spent the night in the camp. Okay, so we see 6 days of marching, and why do we need to repeat the same action day after day? Why is it that we have to have, you see, the 7 trumpets and all of these things that we constantly see repeated, right? The reason why is because repetition actually forms faith, and the silence of the people, the ark at the center, and the steady march teach disciplined waiting. Israel learns that not every promise is fulfilled instantly, as they know because of what we read in Numbers, right? They were wandering in the wilderness for 40 years because of their disobedience. And what we notice in this instance is that not every promise is fulfilled instantly, and that sometimes God trains endurance before he gives breakthrough. Is that endurance, the consistency, the disciplines, the diligence to continue regardless of what you can or cannot see. And patient obedience is more important than impulses, religious impulses, and that zeal that comes up every now and again. So holiness actually looks like staying faithful without visible results. Okay, verse 12 to 16 now. We'll read the seventh day and the final circuit. So we saw the first 6 days, now we're going to see the seventh day. And why does the final day intensify the same command? Verse 12. Then Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horns, before the ark of the Lord passed on, blowing the trumpets continually. The armed men went before them, and the rear guard came after the ark of the Lord, while the trumpets blew continually. On the second day they marched around the city once, and then returned to the camp. They did this for 6 days. On the seventh day they rose early at dawn, and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. It was only on that day that they marched around the city 7 times. And at the 7th time, when the priests had blown the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." Okay, biblical unlock number 3. Why does the 7th day include 7 circuits and a final shout? It's because the 7th day, first and foremost, we saw this in Revelation, the first ever chapter of the Bible that we went through. We saw that there is 7-fold completeness. There's a lot of significance in the number 7. There are 7 seals on the scroll that is held by the lamb that looks like it was slain, right? So that's important for starters. And the second thing is, with 7, the 7th day gathers the whole pattern into climax, right? The holy time, holy presence, and the holy expectancy. Everything is leading up until this point. And the shout here is the people responding once more to the terms that God has given them. And the walls, they fall. And the reason why the walls fall is because God acts, but the people's obedience makes their trust visible. And this is a common misconception, right? Where people think, well, worshipful obedience, it looks like some empty sort of ritual that you're doing day in, day out. And it can be if you are not faithfully participating in God's work. There is a belief here, right? There is a climax that is going to be attained. There is something that we work towards because God's kingdom can be made available here on earth by our participation with Him, right? And this is something that's important, right? We can get into the habit, right, of an empty habit of just doing things with the motions, failing to actually be immersed in what God is trying to tell us, or being immersed in God's wisdom. And this is something that I really want to stress, that we need to be not just doing things out of a habit, something that we tick off, but rather something that we're fully immersed in our everyday lives. That God bleeds into all of the other relationships, all of the other things that we do. Okay, let's read verses 17 to 21 now. This is going to be focused on the city being devoted to destruction and Rahab being spared. My question to you is, why are some things spared while others are forbidden? Let's read verse 17. The city and all that is in it shall be devoted to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall live, because she hid the messengers we sent. As for you, keep away from the things devoted to destruction, so as not to covet. And take any of the devoted things, and make the camp of Israel an object of destruction, bringing trouble upon it. But all silver and gold and vessels of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord. They shall go into the treasury of the Lord. So the people shouted, and the trumpets were blown. As soon as the people heard the sound of the trumpets, they raised a great shout, and the wall fell down flat. So the people charged straight ahead into the city and captured it. Then they devoted to destruction by the edge of the sword all in the city, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys. Okay, biblical unlock number 4. Why is Jericho devoted to destruction, whilst, as we'll see later, Rahab is going to be spared? And the reason why is because the chapter holds together judgment and mercy. Jericho represents entrenched resistance to God, right? The things that they were doing were unmistakably and invariably evil, while Rahab represents faith that has already turned toward the Lord. The devoted status, what does that mean? It means that Israel cannot take the city as private loot. Victory belongs to God and not the conquerors. And in this case, salvation and judgment side by side actually reveal God's holiness, that mercy does not cancel justice and justice does not cancel mercy. So he's merciful towards Rahab but execute his right judgment on those committing evil. Okay, let's read verses 22 to 27 now. We're going to see the focus being Rahab's rescue and Joshua's curse on Jericho. And why does mercy and judgment meet in the same chapter? Verse 22, but to the two men who had spied out the land, Joshua said, go into the prostitute's house and bring the woman out of it, and all who belong to her, as you swore to her. So the young men who had been spies went in and brought Rahab out, along with her father, her mother, her brothers, and all who belonged to her. They brought all her kindred out, and set them outside the camp of Israel. They burned down the city and everything in it. Only the silver and gold and the vessels of bronze and iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. But Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, Joshua spared. Her family has lived in Israel ever since, for she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. Joshua then pronounced this oath, saying, cursed before the Lord be anyone who tries to build this city Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn he shall lay its foundation, and at the cost of his youngest he shall set up its gates. So the Lord was with Jericho, and his fame was in all the land. Alright, final biblical unlock, verses 22 to 27. Why does the chapter end by rescuing Rahab and cursing the city? And the reason why is because the faith here is remembered, and unbelief is not romanticized. Rahab's household, all of them, they were brought into safety. Why? Because they trusted the Lord and they hid the spies. And Joshua's curse marks Jericho as a warning. God's victory is real and his holiness is not to be trifled with. And here, mercy is something which we can regard as God's gift to the believing people. To those who believe, mercy is God's gift, even from an unlikely place. And note that no past can outrun grace when faith turns to God, because Rahab was someone who engaged in sexual sin of many kinds, and yet that does not discount her, that does not make her invalid in the eyes of God. In fact, God's mercy is even more pertinent and more prevalent in her case specifically because of what she has done, the great faith that she had in this particular instance. Okay, let's see how Joshua chapter 6 fulfills Jesus Christ. Okay, so Joshua chapter 6, what does it show? It shows that God wins in ways that humans would not choose. Why did the walls fall? Not because Israel had mastered some sort of siege warfare. It was because God's presence went before them, and their obedience matched his command. In Christ, this pattern reaches its fullest meaning. The kingdom advances through what looks weak before it looks triumphant. And what is the greatest Jericho moment? The cross. The cross itself is the great Jericho moment. Why? Because God overturns the proud powers by a way that looks like defeat. As we read, let's read in Hebrews chapter 11 verse 30. By faith the walls of Jericho fell after they had been encircled for 7 days. The faith here shows something important. It is a call to trusting obedience. What looks slow, what looks strange, what looks quiet may be the very means God uses to bring about victory. Right? Think about this. Jesus Christ was brutally murdered on a cross in a way which was subjected to the most vile of criminals, and it was embarrassing, it was meant to be torturous, and yet that embarrassment turned into the salvation of the entire world. And that is why we need to remember that God acts in ways that we do not know, but we must trust that he will bring about his greater purposes. Alright, so how can we apply this in our everyday life? Obedience. That's what it is. It's about obedience. There are things that God, you can feel in movements in your heart that God is telling you to do, but it feels slow or it feels strange and something that, maybe I shouldn't be doing this or maybe I should just give up. You need to make sure that you continue doing what God is requiring of you without demanding instant results. So for example, maybe you want to read the Bible every day, okay? You read the Bible, you get through genealogy, you get through some like tabernacle building tutorial, and you're like, I really don't feel like reading. I really don't do it. I don't want to do it. But that is what discipline looks like. Your emotions are going to change, but you have to be consistent regardless of your fleeting and changing emotions. And the next thing is repetition. That is what it is about. Repetition. There is scripture that you can read. There are prayers that you can say. You need to repeat it regularly, because that is where you will build that level of discipline and consistency, especially when you feel impatient for a change. So consistency and discipline is essential in the spiritual life. Alright, well that's it for this episode of Biblical Unlocks. We learned that God gives commands that train trust before they bring visible results, that repetition and restraint are a part of how faith is formed, the victory over Jericho belongs to God and not Israel's strength, that Rahab is spared because faith turns towards the Lord even inside a doomed city, and judgment and mercy appear together, so God's holiness is never forgotten. Next time we're going to move from Jericho's collapse to the hidden sins of Joshua chapter 7. We're going to unpack Achan, communal consequences, and why one private compromise can wound a whole people. So that's it for this episode of Biblical Unlocks. If you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to rate the show and follow. It's free, it helps me out a lot, and you can always change your mind later. Otherwise, have a blessed day. And remember, if you're not in your word, you're in your feelings. Godspeed.